the money is not going to, in my view, the organizations who really need it to make this a functioning community and to achieve the type of community that the ultra wealthy think exists there in terms of this small town character. Everybody gets along. We look out for one another. Well, if that were true, these numbers would look a little differently.
Welcome back to Yonder Lies. I'm Hannah Haberman.
And I'm Jesse Bryant. This week we're going to talk about an aspect of the community in Jackson that to some will likely be shocking and to others will be pretty obvious. That's wealth. And we're not talking about six-figure incomes, but 9 and 10. We know that this topic has been really divisive in the community for decades, but we think the story of this place is incomplete without it.
For those who don't know, Teton County, Wyoming is by many measures the wealthiest county in the United States. It has the highest per capita income of all 3,144 counties in the U.S. at $194,485 per year. The county with the second highest per capita income, Manhattan, is 24% lower at a mere $148,002. All this is to say, if you're in the 1% in Teton County, you're making $28.2 million per year. Per year, $28.2 million.
Yeah, and although the high-end and even average incomes in Teton County are essentially next to none, salaries in the area have actually flatlined for decades. Whereas the average income in the county in 2015 was the highest of any county at, again, about $195,000 per year, the average salary was actually only $41,000.
Wait, I think I'm a bit confused. What's the difference between income and salary? And why does that distinction matter?
Yeah, it's kind of subtle. But it's basically this. Whereas salary is how much money you get paid for your work, income is how much you get paid for your work plus the money you make from your investments. And in Teton County, these two numbers have been diverging enormously throughout the past half century. Here, I've got the perfect person to make this a little more clear.
I'm Justin Farrell, author of Billionaire Wilderness and sociology professor at Yale University in our School of the Environment. So salary and wages are usually earned from a specific job, and that's income for sure, but income can also include other sources. For the relative to this book, financial investments are a huge part of that. And so those don't necessarily come from your salary per se. And the more money you make, the more money you make. It's called cumulative advantage. And so if you do have a high salary, you can put that money to work and increase your income. Relative to the community, there are a lot of jobs available in Teton County. It's not difficult to find a job in Jackson or in the surrounding area. And what's difficult is to find a salary that would allow you to live somewhere nearby. And the reason for that is because the total income of the ultra wealthy, which is largely within that community from financial investments, is just so much higher. For example, in the book, I talk about how 8 out of every $10 made in Teton County comes from financial investments, which is an incredible amount of money, $3.4 billion, I believe, off the top of my head. Whereas that was just not the case if you look back to 1970s, 1980s, when that number began to climb.
Justin's new book, titled Billionaire Wilderness, The Ultrawealthy and the Remaking of the American West, has already sent alarms into the social immune system here in Jackson. Reviews have sensationalized the book's finding, and reactions have been pretty polarized.
Yeah, and in the Facebook comments, Justin is either a socialist or an elitist or not a real Wyomingite, all of which, if you know anything about Wyoming, are funny charges for people in Teton County to be making about someone who's the son of a railroad worker from Cheyenne. And of course, it doesn't seem clear whether anyone's actually read the book, which is actually a pretty fascinating ethnography of the ultra-wealthy, of people who are often really good at staying hidden.
There's no scholarly agreed upon definition of ultra wealthy or even rich, a more general term that I try as hard as I can to avoid in the book. Folks who study high net worth individuals like me, well, I'm not a high net worth individual, I study them, but they tend to fall somewhere between 8 million and 30 million in assets. So 15 million for me, was a good indicator that your assets, both statistically relative to the U.S. population, but also just in real terms, that you had enough money to live in Teton County, but you also had so much more money than the average American. And 15 million, I would say, was very low for the folks that I interviewed. And many people that I interviewed were far above that.
The first question I have about all of this is why? How did this happen? How did this isolated valley of Jackson Hole in the middle of nowhere in Wyoming, the state with the least amount of people, end up with more billionaires than anywhere else in the country?
I mean, the first thing is that Wyoming doesn't have a corporate or individual income tax, which always puts it atop Bloomberg's wealth-friendliest states.
The most important condition in my mind is that it's a tax haven. And so we tend to think of tax havens as far away on offshore islands. But, as I show in the book, some are perched atop these pristine mountains of the West. And we see that in the data, and that, billions of untaxed dollars have flooded into rural communities across the West, especially places like Teton County. And the result of the wealth was not this broad-based economic growth or rising wages or rising salaries. And so it's not work in a typical sense. And so, until the 1980s, Teton County really mirrored the rest of the U.S. relative to especially financial investment income. And so if you look at the data, that to me is hard to deny as the main reason why.
Justin also mentioned two other factors, one that's pretty obvious and the other that's a little more subtle. First, it's obviously just a beautiful place here. If I had $1 million to spend and I could live anywhere I wanted, why would I not want the Grand Teton in my backyard? But the second and maybe more subtle factor is the airport. There are direct flights every day to major cities across the country, which is, as some might know, very rare in this part of the country.
And so here in Jackson, we have an elite class, like no other, who are here largely, in some ways, because of tax benefits, but also because it's a great place to live, and because there's an airport that provides daily global access. But perhaps surprisingly, there are also some other ways that the ultra-wealthy can benefit financially from what might be understood to many as plain and simple environmentalism.
This is most commonly done through something called a conservation easement, which is essentially a legal agreement a private landowner goes into that says they'll manage their land towards some conservation goal over some set of time in exchange for some tax or financial benefits.
That's pretty straightforward. You receive, it usually comes to you as a charitable deduction to your adjusted gross income, usually up to 15 years, or a cash payment based on the appraised value of your land, in exchange for agreeing to put your land under easement, which is a form of conservation. And so that's the primary way. And, obviously not all easements are created equal, and conservation easements are, in my view, a really important tool for global conservation, but they do work differently in Teton County, not just because 97% of the land is already under federal protection, but just how much money this land is worth, and then as a consequence, how much it can benefit you. And in the book, I have some interesting, quotes from financial planners and folks who work on financial strategy, and just talk about how effective this strategy can be for preserving your wealth. And I have a couple quotes, about people who make a killing on the stock market. And now they're trying to offset that income with a huge tax deduction. And so it's very straightforward. And I think for people who are in that industry and in conservation, it's really not that surprising. And some may say, well, you're killing two birds with one stone. And that's true. But I think we tend to focus on the conservation aspect and view it as this altruistic behavior when it's more complicated than that.
So it's not that conservation easements are bad. I mean, it seems that Justin feels easements are necessary strategies for landscape conservation, but it also seems like, in this context, the incentives are a little bit more complicated.
Exactly. And what I think is cool here is that, like, in many cases, nature and the environment are genuinely really important to these folks. And it's not just about the money. In the book, Justin has this interesting concept of what he calls connoisseur conservationism, in which nature is viewed as just another fine thing in life, like, say, whiskey.
So that's another way I try to package why nature is especially meaningful to the ultra wealthy, and then how they put it to use to solve some of these dilemmas they face about how they should enjoy their money and how they can connect with nature. And so there are a few different components to that. One is that nature for them is very medicinal and very therapeutic, perhaps more so than people from other walks of life or other social classes, and that they view themselves as needing entry into nature more than anyone else, because they do need to recharge their batteries. They have been running this rat race, whether it's on Wall Street or some other industry that demands a lot of time, energy, and can exhaust you. That nature provides this way, especially in the Tetons, which is beautiful nature at its best in their view, that it can recharge your batteries and you can become whole. And some of them would even use spiritual language, that it restores their soul. And these are common themes within American environmentalism and romanticism and transcendentalism and these different movements. But what was really interesting to me was how much they viewed that they needed it. And then two was like that they viewed it as another highbrow taste. And so the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is one of the last large intact ecosystems. And it really is some of the best ecologically that the United States has to offer, if you want to look at it that way. And so like, an upscale art or upscale fine wine, the Tetons and in that area and the wildlife therein is the pinnacle. It's the best of the best. And so it mirrored those other high status tastes that you would find in other, studies of the rich and other studies of cultural capital. And so if you do have a place out in that area, you have one of the best places, that you can find, and the most prestigious places when you're back in Greenwich, Connecticut at a cocktail party talking about what you did last weekend, or where you go for the summer, or maybe where you're moving full time, that you're moving to the place that has and offers the best. Nature also provides this moral loophole, whereas if you're spending your money on these things, these medicinal and therapeutic experiences, or this 10,000 square foot home that you have, that indulgent consumption is morally permissible if it is nature oriented. So if you do build this $15 million home in this ecosystem, that's okay, or it's more okay, because it is allowing you to recharge your batteries, to become whole, to connect with nature, and then by extension, likely to get involved in conservation. And so connoisseur conservation also involves consumption, and consumption, massive amounts of consumption, whether that's electricity to heat your floors in your homes during the winter, maybe when you're not even there, or your driveway. But it's all, again, more morally permissible because it is nature oriented.
I'll be honest, this is the part of the story that when I read it, I was like, that's kind of me. Not because I'm ultra wealthy, but because I think I also indulge in that same sort of thinking.
Yeah. I mean, we both like to rock climb, and I feel like climbers talk a lot about routes kind of like whiskey or, the finer things in life. Climbers are always talking about the aesthetic experience of a climb, about fine positioning or pure movements or beautiful views. It's the same thing with skiing, too.
Yeah. I feel what Justin is talking about here is actually a lot bigger than just the ultra wealthy. A lot of us that live here in Jackson all kind of buy into these stories about pure nature, the wilderness, where us rugged individuals are out there away from politics, just savoring the most beautiful, whatever 5-star rock climb, perfectly groomed mountain bike trail, or like a fresh powder run.
Yeah, people are in pursuit of the finest, the best. And this projection of an apolitical bubble in the Tetons is especially interesting. Not only because it's just not true that we're all exempt from responsibility out here and that politics don't exist, but also because some sorts of ultra-wealthy environmentalism do actually seem apolitical.
No, I didn't find many differences across the political spectrum relative to connoisseur conservation or the way that they engage with nature. The one thing that I did find that I don't write a lot about in the book because I don't think it emerged as a strong enough pattern in terms of differences, like to write about, but talk about climate change and talk about thinking beyond saving the moose. So these narrow issues that everyone's kind of focused on in the community, some were able to think outside of that and think about the way climate change is impacting those charismatic animals that you like to see. And so, but overall, this wasn't a story about greedy conservative people holding on to their wealth. I talked with conservatives, I talked with independents, I talked with Democrats, and many of the patterns in the book reflect that. I think some of the discussions in the chapter on guilt about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and some of the trickle-down economic theory that I found present, that is, just present in American culture and in our economic system. I think that may have been stronger for some of the folks who tend to identify as more conservative, but that's expected, and that's, to me, that wasn't at all that interesting. And so, no, what was maybe more interesting was the way that these findings transcend some of the political divisions that at present seem to define everything about our country and all the discussions we're having. It conforms to the main finding of there is no social class, here, that we're all just in love with Wyoming. We're all connecting with nature. Just like, political ideology might fade away when you're out on a hike, so do social class differences in the community. And that was one of my main findings, was the way that everyone with wealth wants to be normal, wants to see the community as normal, wants to see a community that is undivided, that isn't wrapped up in all the political argumentation and the polarized discourse, that, we're all here beneath in the shadow of the Tetons to just enjoy nature, to get outside and to celebrate, what this place has to offer. And when you start to dig into, differences between your conservative friend or your liberal friend, that's a faux pas, just like it is to talk about the reality of what wealth has done to this community, and in a way that is unacknowledged, at least from my vantage point.
Support for Yonder Lies comes from Think WY, Wyoming Humanities. Wyoming Humanities supports programs, grants, and initiatives in Teton County and across Wyoming that explore history, culture, and the human experience. To learn more about the Wyoming Humanities Council, visit thinkwy.org. Again, that's thinkwy.org. Perhaps the most important political question in Jackson, Wyoming, and to be honest, also in our politics across the board right now, is, can wealth solve the problems that it causes? This is the question that has even defined the current Democratic presidential primary.
Right. And in Jackson, I think the answer lies in whether the wealthy can actually identify, to begin with, the problems that need solving, and not just the problems that they think need solving. In other words, can they fund organizations that will actually have an impact on the effects of wealth inequality? But also, I think it's an interesting question to ask. Why is there such a market for philanthropy here to begin with?
Before jumping into the disparities in giving, I think it's really important that we understand why there is a need or a market for philanthropy in the first place. And ironically, and I think somewhat counterintuitively, the influx of this great wealth actually created a greater need for charitable giving. And so there's this hole that needs to be filled that everyone acknowledges when they're talking about philanthropy, but it's based on this paradox. And it starts with a question about, can wealth solve the very problems that wealth itself creates? And so I think we need to first step back before looking at, who gets what money. Why is there a need for philanthropy? And why are organizations that I show that are underfunded, why aren't they funded from other sources that wouldn't depend on the whims of the ultra wealthy? There's a market for philanthropy in Teton County, and I begin this chapter asking, well, why is there a market for that? Why is there a great need for charitable giving that is then ostensibly filled by the ultra wealthy, and praise is heaped on the community as it being, as I have all these quotes, it's the most philanthropic community in the country. You have a huge number of nonprofit organizations relative to the number of people who live in Teton County. And so the concept and the need for idea about philanthropy is just pervasive. And among the ultra wealthy, I found that there is a widespread perception that their philanthropy, can make up for some of the problems that they see. In other words, there's a perception that plutocracy can indeed work and work well, and that plutocracy, which essentially means a society run and guided by a small number of wealthy people, that there's a sense of the concentration of wealth among a very few actually has the potential to transform a community for the better, and that as long as the wealthy are being philanthropic and are loosening their grip on some of their money, that they can give it and that it can help the charitable organizations that are laboring at the ground level, that they can get their work done, and that some of these problems can be solved. And so that's kind of where I start with this chapter, this perception, this widespread perception that it is a very philanthropic community. And yet I also point out that wealth has caused a lot of the problems that are right now being attempted to are filled by the wealthy themselves.
So it seems like if plutocracy is gonna work, and by work I mean create a functional, healthy, stable community, and I'm not saying that this is possible, but if you wanted to make plutocracy work, you'd really want whoever those plutocrats are to be really good at identifying the real problems in the community and putting their money in the right places to make the community better.
And so I asked in this chapter, in the wealthiest community, in the wealthiest country in the world, where exactly is all this money flowing? And secondly, where is all this social influence flowing? Because that is also, as important and sometimes more important than just financial giving is the human capital and the social capital that is provided to some of these organizations. And so is all this wealth that, these folks told me that they were giving, is it to alleviate suffering, to promote greater equity, as is the assumed purpose of philanthropy, or to preserve threatened ecosystems, or to fight climate change and things like that? And so I dug into the data to see where it was, what was the truth, and how to separate, these perceptions from reality on the ground. And really, what I found, to put it, succinctly, is that a lot of the arts and environmental organizations have the wealth, have the assets, and that has really exploded within the last few decades. I have data in the book starting from 1997 and just showing the growth of assets and comparing organizations like the Jackson Hole Land Trust or the Community Center for the Arts, the Grand Teton Music Festival, and to see how they've done since 1997 compared to some of the main social services organizations and organizations that are trying to keep up with how ultra wealth has transformed this community, transformed the housing markets, and they've just flatlined for the most part. And I think it's, even just since I've written the book, I'm hopeful that that's changed a little bit. I haven't seen the data, but in terms of the long-term trends that we see, the money is not going to, in my view, the organizations who really need it to make this a functioning community and to achieve the type of community that the ultra wealthy think exists there in terms of this small town character. Everybody gets along. We look out for one another. Well, if that were true, these numbers would look a little differently. They are contributing to some of the needs, and they're filling some of those needs. And I think relative to environmental issues, that's true. But for me, the other half of my analysis is why. So what is it about these other issues that are not getting the attention that they need? And so in my interviews, I probed on these issues and found that there was a hesitancy to, one, get involved in these issues that could be viewed as political. So some of the environmental issues, they may be politicized locally, but these are not deeply political issues like climate change that are requiring us to restructure the energy sector, to rethink how we consume, and these deeper issues that are going to require policy that are going to go to the heart of some of our political institutions. And so they favored non-confrontational environmental work. But also, and perhaps more cynically, there are self-serving reasons that, not just because they want to protect their own viewshed or the wildlife that they like to show their friends when their friends visit them, but many of the issues that are viewed as most prestigious and in which the social circles in which they run, that they're rewarded with social prestige by working in the arts sector or working in the environmental sector, and so there was also a social function to it as well, in addition to giving money to causes they care about, but they receive social benefits from certain sectors, but from not others. And so these buzzkill issues, as I call them, which, homelessness in the elementary school or hunger or things like that, they moved here to get away from those issues in some regard. And to see them can cast a shadow on this paradise. And so when they're looking to give their money, or when they're looking to go to, an event where there may be a talk and there may be an ask for a donation, they're opting to go to these prestigious events that conform with the reason why they moved to the community in the first place. And that has to do with environment, that has to do with these other highbrow tastes like the music festival and things like that. And so it's just an easier transition to make than, getting involved in fighting hunger or getting involved in the political process to try to provide better policy so people don't get evicted, to provide and solve the problem of affordable housing, which are very difficult issues and which involve engagement in the political process, unlike some of the other more, environmental and arts related philanthropic opportunities.
So, it kind of doesn't seem like plutocracy is going to work here. The social structures are already formed for the ultra-wealthy in a way that blinds them to the more real community problems. For plutocracy to work, you need an ultra-wealthy class who are also engaged and, in some ways, expert in politics. And here in Jackson, we largely have the opposite.
Yeah, and I think this question of how should billionaires, if they do exist, be integrated into society so that people and the environment flourish seems to be something we've sort of forgotten how to do these days.
And while there are actually many similar myths of pure nature that Americans of all classes indulge in, the way some of these interact with the social conundrum of being ultra-wealthy in 2020 is pretty fascinating.
So the West has always provided this myth that is deeply meaningful to many Americans, and we're socialized into it through media, through movies, through music. And I saw that at play in this ultra-wealthy population. And part of it had to do with these social stigmas that they face. And that is the reason why, in my view, these myths resonated so strongly with this group of people. And so they're burdened by these greedy social stigmas, this anxiety about their status as an ultra-wealthy person in the 21st century, where they're hearing conflicting messages, whether it's, we elected an ultra-wealthy celebrity president, but on the other hand, you have people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and even more moderate Democrats criticizing wealth and criticizing the billionaire class, and that can lead to feelings of inauthenticity or questioning or being anxious about your role in society. And so the ultra wealthy use these myths, and they use this romantic view of rural people as a vehicle for their own personal transformation. And so they attempt to create these versions of themselves that they view as more authentic, more virtuous, more community minded. And so this personal transformation is modeled after this popular idea of this working poor person in a rural Western landscape who, they may not have a high status career. They may not have the types of material comforts and luxuries that I have. But you know what? They seem free from the snares of wealth and power. They seem free from the traps and the moral predicaments that I've been placed in my rise up this corporate ladder, the decisions I've had to make, the sacrifices I've maybe had to make at times to my own moral character. And so they view this stereotype, the stereotypical Western working poor person, that they are living this noble life of contentment, of frontier authenticity, that they're part of a community that is deeply cohesive, that it has these old-time values. And then they also have this special kinship with nature. They like to go, hiking in the mornings. They like to go ski off these high alpine in these high alpine environments, and they connect with nature in that way. And so that also includes, the ranching culture and the myth of Wyoming and this cowboy who, lives this life on the range. And so it's all kind of blended together into this romantic stereotype. What was interesting to me is that the wealthy folks perform this social conversion in all sorts of different ways. And so they signify outwardly that they've made this transition. And so this could include their friendships with working poor people, or maybe lower income and sometimes middle class people, but oftentimes it was this listie that was barely getting by that they had in mind. It was this barista who maybe working at the coffee shop. They also work in the village or taking lift tickets and things like that. But again, they view them as having this experience that sometimes they wish they would have had, and that they're trying to regain. Another way they perform this social conversion is their relationship with nature, and that manifests itself in all sorts of ways, through connoisseur conservation, as I discussed in one chapter, but also this professed environmental concern that you move to this area, you immediately get invited to this elite picnic or this event to raise money for this particular issue, whether it's like wildlife art or whether it's the stream quality behind your house, or to save this charismatic species and this animal and that animal. So they become more environmentally engaged, but they also appropriate frontier art and styles of dress. And so talk about their love of Wrangler jeans and similar jeans like it, sometimes cowboy boots, and just this general love of Western character that they try to live out. I think by living in these rural and nature-oriented communities, it allows them to literally buy into this idea and this experience of a primordial Western Americana setting that offers salvation from that rat race that they were running. And they're able to move to a setting that is ostensibly simpler, and where these honest rural values prevail, and where they can kind of live the life of this dusty cowboy, or a noble native person, or a nature-loving van plan bohemian. And those are all kind of lumped into the same category. Yet the irony is that this popular idea of the working poor is mostly off or completely off base than the reality of a working immigrant family, sharing a trailer, rotating through the night and day on beds because they don't have enough space to sleep, and they're working 2 to 3 jobs and barely getting by, and they wish they had more time to go into the park, and they wish they had more time to learn about why it is that their rent goes up and up and up with each month that passes. And so there's all sorts of these stereotypes that are integrated with nature, but also integrated with this culture and this myth that still prevails in the American West.
I mean, are we just living in like an actual version of HBO's Westworld? Some American West theme park where once you have enough money, you can go live out your mythological fantasies. Is that what's going on here?
Yeah, it sometimes does feel like that. But feeling like we're part of some theme park fantasy still obscures the realities and inequalities taking place in this community. The stuff that's not part of a TV show.
The flood of wealth in communities like this has created, I think, a community veneer, they call it, where the way it plays out is that it deliberately conceals these outward indicators of socioeconomic and racial and ethnic inequalities, that when you have such a top-heavy class, that it can bestow rewards and for trivial acts of individual charity, of selective environmentalism that, in my view, hide and cover over these patterns of structural harm. And I think that the need for philanthropy in this community, again, it can just be a source for alleviating personal guilt. And it really disguises and forecloses the need for economic and political action for addressing concerns locally, but also concerns globally relative to wealth concentration in the United States and globally, but also really significant environmental problems that we're facing at a global level relative to climate change. And so wealth can really distort and create a veneer about what is really going on underneath the surface.
You know, like 5 years ago, I was talking to my friend Alice, and she just sort of off the cuff said this thing that has really stuck for me. She said, Jackson's like a bar of fudge. It tastes really good for a while, but it's not food. And I think that's sort of what Justin's getting at here.
Yeah, I like that image a lot. But if you think Jackson is a bar of fudge, that's all you're ever going to see. And I think that sort of thinking, where everything is fudge, breeds apathy. And if everyone, I mean the ultra wealthy and the not so ultra wealthy, just keep living out their stories here without broadening our understandings of what's actually happening, I'm not sure where we're going.
It's just going to continue to get worse unless there are changes to policy. And so for people like need to get involved and almost at a state level. And I don't know how that looks, on the ground. And like, that's where I kind of stop short and then become just the average citizen, because I'm just trying to provide like a diagnosis of the problem.
It's going to be kind of hard to mobilize people in a place whose founding myth is that of leisure. I just don't see it happening. Is my pessimism a sort of apathy?
And then, in the epilogue, I do try to offer some solutions relative to, economic solutions about how to demand more from this class of migrants who have come to Wyoming to enjoy its, bounty of natural resources, but also not really giving much back relative to income tax or corporate tax. And so it's like the real issue has to do with that, but also trying to find ways constructively draw on these sentiments that kind of are ironic or off-putting about, wearing Wranglers or connecting with the locals and seeing their servants as their friends. How can folks draw constructively on those sentiments and that yearning for transformation that the ultra wealthy are undertaking and are putting into practice in this community? Like, how can you harness that for good? And I don't think it's like ask them to donate more. I think it's, hey, we need your energy. We need your political capital, your social and human capital to help us make changes that are going to last and that are going to actually restructure how money is flowing into this community and how housing works and local policies. That's all easier said than done, though. Like, that's going to be a monumental task. I'm very critical of wealth and the wealthy, but I'm not laughing at them. It's not just pointing fingers and being like, these people are like jackasses or something, or they're so out of touch. I mean, I show that. I just show it basically, And I think right now, what we need is like organized action rather than just being pissed or, laughing at them and just kind of rolling our eyes. Yeah, this community has changed. And I had someone do it in my class last week about the Sagebrush Rebellion. Like, oh, these people are crazy. Haha. Like, no, it's not actually that funny, because they're reshaping American politics in the West. There are people who have Donald Trump's ear who have staged like armed rebellions in our own country. And you can laugh at them as this like left-leaning liberal sitting in a classroom in Yale, but what good does that do us? In the same way, like people did the same thing with climate denialists, like, oh, these crazy bloggers, making up shit about climate change and writing their own papers and doing that, this and that. Well, look where we're at, 30 plus years of inaction on climate change, large majority of which is due to the fact that people were spreading lies about climate change and were funded by fossil fuel companies who helped them promote and provide a stage for that. And it's woven into the fabric of an entire party in our country and is basically the policy now. And so similarly, I think we can laugh off wealth and we can say, like, oh, damn those rich people, but it doesn't mean anything unless we actually like try to figure out a way to make structural changes. And that's going to be very difficult in a state like Wyoming, who is averse to, taxation and averse to passing laws like that. And frankly, is averse to Teton County, but also something that I am constantly perplexed by is this the like my family in Cheyenne or other friends in Cheyenne and all of them, and like anyone around Wyoming for the most part doesn't view this as Wyoming, and they resent all the East Coast transplants, and they resent the Californians, and resent this and that. Yet still they won't require anything from them. And so to me, that is this like inconsistency or paradox that I'm just like befuddled by. But it also, makes perfect sense relative to the history of the state and their libertarian bent.
It is quite the paradox. Teton County is really unique in the context of Wyoming, and that definitely does create tension between the county and the rest of the state. And that tension results in a lot of difficulty for policymakers at the state level, as they're trying to make rules that make sense for the rest of Wyoming and also for Teton County, which is just different. Jackson is sort of a city-state.
Yeah, that's kind of a funny way to put it.
A place with more wealth and natural capital than it knows what to do with. I guess that's how a lot of city-states are.
Yeah, I mean, I actually lived in Geneva, Switzerland for a while, and Jackson in some ways feels really similar to that place. But I will say, it seems like Geneva has a bit better of an understanding about how to take care of its people, and hasn't so much taken an eye off the ball when it comes to funding what is required to create a high quality of life.
What I do support is a community that ensures opportunity for all, a community that is environmentally engaged in ways that are actually tackling problems that need to be tackled, and that a community that ensures what I would call, human flourishing, and one that does not cover over inequities or pretend that they don't exist, and also one that supports policies that will require more from folks at the very, 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 very top to ensure that there's education, that opportunities, people aren't going hungry in the richest county, in the richest country in the world. And so essentially one that supports the type of community that everyone wish exists and that the ultra wealthy, I think exists right now.
Having the chance to talk with Justin challenged me to think about billionaires, wealth, and the myths I hold about this community in a way that at times feels uncomfortable, but also feels undeniably necessary.
Yeah, for me, in making this episode, I also felt like I learned a lot about myself too. Like, a lot of what's motivating the ultra wealthy is what's also motivating me. Maybe the main difference is that I actually believe pretty intensely in democracy as opposed to plutocracy.
Yeah, but I think it's important to mention too that not all of the ultra-wealthy folks believe that politics is made best by the elite. And also, judging from the Facebook comments on the reviews of Billionaire Wilderness, it seems too that there are folks across the class spectrum that think that wealth should buy you power. The whole point of this isn't to villainize the ultra-wealthy, here or anywhere else, I think. As Justin said, a huge part of the project moving forward is figuring out how to draw on the desire of the ultra-wealthy to undergo this transformative experience when they move to this landscape, to integrate into what they see as a normal, small-town America, to cope with some of their guilt and connect with nature. How do we draw on those desires in ways which do promote human flourishing, the flourishing of everyone in this community, and frankly, this whole planet?
Yeah, I mean, I support arts and environmental causes too, and I think those are parts of a functioning community. But it also kind of seems like a moot point when some people's basic needs, housing, food, transportation, a living wage, aren't being met. But what would it take to rewrite the script? To make the norm for those ultra-wealthy people to shift their social prestige and financial capital and participate in philanthropy that does address these pressing social issues in addition to environmental ones.
Totally. We just can't keep pretending like Jackson is, as you said earlier, like continually eating a bar of fudge. This community veneer Justin mentions, where the dominant narrative is to obscure inequalities and the harm caused by them, it's gotta come down. And only when we understand that this veneer exists can we start dismantling it. And not only that, but we can start funneling all this social capital, this financial capital that is concentrated here in such extremes, to addressing some of the issues Justin points to: affordable housing, homelessness, hunger, and more divisive and complex environmental issues. At the end of the day, we've got to require more of each other. We've got to hold each other's feet to the fire. We have to look harder at the myths we have about this place and start facing the realities.
More of each other, sure. But there's also this truth to the saying, with great power comes great responsibility. It seems that right now, at least, Jackson will go the way of those in power. This county has greater wealth inequality than any other in the United States, which in some ways means that the wealthy should have more responsibility than anywhere in the United States.
In a future episode, we'll explore another community in Jackson whose connection to this place is, in some interesting ways, entangled with the ultra-wealthy. The Latinx community in Jackson makes up 30% of the town's population, despite being mostly invisible in the dominant stories of this place.
We also wanted to thank Justin Farrell for helping out with this episode. And if you want to learn more, pick up a copy of his new book, Billionaire Wilderness.
Thanks for listening. Technical support comes from Jackson's community radio station, KHOL 89.1, and the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative. A big thanks to the Jackson Hole Historical Society for providing access to hours of archival audio. Special shout out to Doug Haberman for our theme music and Becca Holt-Hewson for our beautiful cover art.
If you haven't already, please rate and subscribe on iTunes or Spotify. And if you'd like to support the show with a small monthly donation, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/yonderlies. That's patreon.com/yonderlies.